Good afternoon. So I'm going to be looking at possession sequences today, trying to build a framework to categorize and then analyze possession sequences. It's a framework that use cases can be built on top of, so I'm going to use a few use cases to also show what it can do. So this study was inspired by this article by Marek, where he called for a new type of analytics, where he claimed that the current analytics is concentrated on kind of on-ball event, shots, passes, and football isn't like that. Football is more dynamic, and this kind of dynamism of football plays out on spatial grounds and then also temporal. But he says that this is a large area of analysis that hasn't been touched yet. And then this obviously kind of leads to, well, we need tracking data to achieve this. And Marek's suggestion is that there is a rich data source within the event data. So this kind of resonated with me at the time and has inspired this presentation. So just for some points of clarity to start with, possessions are defined of a team owning the ball and then will only finish when the other team gains the ball, whereas sequences are defined as passages of play which can end in a defensive action, a stoppage, or a shot. So I'm concentrating on sequences of possessions rather than possessions themselves. The data set is the big 5 leagues from last season, 1,800 games, and then sequences that have more than 2 actions within them. So sequences are relatively intuitive to understand. If we see this Opta image, we can kind of understand what happened. Based on Liverpool, we can kind of infer quite a bit of information on that, maybe who scored, who was involved, but it's very intuitive to see, and this was within the raw data. So it's intuitive when we see them plotted as images. So my route of analysis was, how can I minimize the graphical representation of these sequences? So this is a pitch, 128 by 128 pixels, attacking direction from bottom to up. As you can see, this kind of squiggly line is the sequence of the possession, and you can see here the white is the start of the possession. It kind of fades to black or darker as time passes. So the spatial and the temporal elements of the possession are embedded within the image. And the great thing about grayscale images is that they're just data points. So this is 128 by 128 is 16,000 pixels. So we can show this possession sequence and each possession sequence within these data points. So if we take kind of 100 randomly selected sequences, you can kind of intuitively kind of map them in your mind of what happened. They're very different. You have some where you can see the temporal change, and this one as well, where there's the gray starts to come in, which is very complex possession. But these images are still 16,000 data points, which is a lot. So I want to reduce that further. So the first part of the reduction is using an autoencoder, which is in 2 parts. The encoder, which takes the input data and tries to compress it to a lower dimensions. And then the second part is the decoder, which is basically the reverse and tries to predict the input. So as you can see here, the input is relatively similar to the output. So the encoder is generally working well, and it runs through, tries to learn patterns, and tries to predict the output. And here we have the compressed representation, which is called the latent space. And from here we can kind of pull out the latent vector of each image. So this is like the reduced version of the image, which is 256 data points. So now we're relatively happy that with some error and some loss that we can change the 16,000 data points to 256, which is still quite a lot to deal with. In our heads, we can map this space, but it'll be very difficult for us to intuitively understand where each possession fits. So these kind of latent vectors, you can see 3 differing latent vectors. These are the vectors mapped out with sequences. So you can see that 3 different sequences turn into 3 different latent vectors. And similarly, with 3 similar vectors, you can also see that there are some similarities within the latent vector. So now we're relatively comfortable that with, admittedly with some loss, we have a representation at a lower dimension of the possession sequence, now at 256. But 256 is still a lot. We can't kind of process it within our heads, so I've used this t-SNE algorithm which further reduces the dimensions. So this is 2D space, and all possessions that are kind of similar in this high dimensional space will be in a similar position in 2 dimensions. So we've now got these possession sequences down to just 2 dimensions. To check that it's working, if we randomly select a couple of images or sequences from this point in the latent space, we can see that they're kind of similar. They're across the pitch. They're generally slanted down from left to right. And then in some of them, there's kind of some kind of action on the right side as well. So we're comfortable that that's similar, and these are also generally similar in the center of the pitch. They're small number of actions. It's vertical with a slight kink in it. So we're now at a point where within 2D space, we can categorize all of the possession sequences. Next, we can bucket those. So we can create these 900 odd buckets and then just count possession sequences within each bucket. So what we can do with this is then take every team in the top 5 leagues, count all the possession sequences that go into those buckets, and then compare them against the league average. So this is what this looks like. Red is higher than league average, and blue is lower than league average. So now you can kind of see some patterns. You can kind of see City and Barcelona, Real Madrid, PSG have similar kind of possession sequences. You can also see that Stoke and West Brom kind of have similar. And if we use this in the club, we would kind of get used to working like which bucket means which, but it's not very intuitive in this form. So what I've basically done is rearrange the buckets into a more sensible format and created this sequence dictionary. So now we have six different categories: segments, which are like 3 to 5 shots, small, short sequences, often transitions or maybe failed initiations. We have fragments, which are very like 2 to 3 actions. It's unclear what the objectives of these sequences are. And then mid-length, 4 to 8, seems to have a purpose and intent, and with varying different types and objectives. And then direct, just kind of long ball football. Verticals, where there's a decent vertical gain. And then complex sequences, which have a high technical demand. Now we have a dictionary, and like the periodic table, there's also some logic of where they place within each segment. So you have this one on the bottom left is situated here, which is also kind of bottom left of the pitch, and then top right is top right. So now we have kind of a logical framework where we can intuitively look at it and see what type of team styles or possession styles. So that's position framework. So Barcelona kind of changes from this to this, which from the left side of being pretty unintuitive to the right side being relatively intuitive. So the darker reds, remember, are higher than league average. So you've got this kind of possession for Barcelona, which kind of makes sense. And then this type as their other high value, which is an attempt to play out from the back. Napoli, very different. This is their highest bucket with kind of maybe fast transitional, fragmented to a certain extent play. And then mid-lengths, which are kind of this one, which is kind of complicated across the pitch movement. And then Burnley, obviously we've got just the long ball. So now we have like a better intuitive way of using these buckets. So we have the Premier League. La Liga. Bundesliga. Serie A. So now we have a framework that, personally, I'm pretty comfortable that it provides an intuitive way of seeing the frequency of possession types from each team. So this is like what Marek asked for in his article, which is more of a framework, more of a language to allow other analysis to be built on. So although this is like the meat of the work, I wanted to also produce some utility cases. So utility cases, how can it be used for the coaching team? So how do we prep for the North London Derby? So one way of doing it is coach generation possessions. So the coaches watch the opposition and then they tell you what possessions that they liked, and then they don't know which possessions go into which bucket, but then you can provide them very instantly other types of possessions that they feel is really important and just give them video. This all exports to XML. You can import it to programs such as Sports Code. And then if you have Huddle at the front end of that, then coaches can see that easily. There's obviously other platforms available. The other way of the analysis generating the possessions that the coaching team will look at. So you can have possessions for and against. You've seen the for, but you can also flip that. So what possession sequences do the team defend against? And then you can sum the XGs within each bucket to also provide for and against XG. And then offset, so a way of taking possessions for and then the opposition possessions against, and then kind of seeing which possessions are more likely to occur in the match or less likely to occur in the match. So you can kind of mock this front end up. Watch out for your personal data. But this could be an intuitive way for coaches to kind of interact with this framework. So they can select the different types of possessions, and then you'd have a playlist that would play them. This is the XG, so XG4, so Tottenham's expected goals, how it fits into different buckets, and the XG that they concede on the right side. Again, you can select the buckets, and then the coach will be able to see the video. So that's one way of how a coaching team can use it. So how could management use it? So how could it help with due diligence of replacing Conte? So obviously there's a large cost of replacing a manager. Maybe it's a new playing style. With that will be a transitional period. And there's obviously a new cost of new players and exiting players as they match to a new style. So teams could decide to try and identify teams that play in this very similar style to them in terms of possession sequences. So what I've done here is nearest neighbour matching with Chelsea's possessions and then the opposition possessions that they face against. So we're going to plot them out. On the x-axis is the Chelsea's possessions, and then on the y is the opposition. So the ideal point is down here because they'll be closely matched to Chelsea. So we have our 98 teams, and then we kind of have 5 teams that are close down in this example. So who are they? Gattuso. So he's had a pretty decent season. Last year his contract was extended. They're an okay position in the table. So there's one option. Roberto De Zerbi. So they were actually relegated from Serie A, but he was being kind of quoted in the news of being the best, worst team around. So he was lauded for his attempt to try and play good football, even though that they were relegated. Lucien Favre, who's obviously doing pretty well this season. And then Marcelino Garcia Toral, who's kind of reversed Valencia's big dip in their ELO rating. So there's a long fall, and he's kind of reversed that. And last season had a big step of 100 ELO points. So he's had a pretty decent season. So these are managers that match well. Here are some other selected teams. And then obviously Napoli, who they went for. So that's not to say that was a wrong decision for Chelsea, but it kind of illustrates the distance in playing style and the amount of transition time that Chelsea may need to achieve that. Another use case of how it can help recruitment. So how can it help replace a retiring David Silva? So we can create these kind of player dashboards with the same framework, but counting each action. So it doesn't matter the type of action, just summing the amount of actions in each bucket, and then we create this kind of player dashboard. So obviously he's very high and complex on the left upper side. Obviously complex has more actions involved in them inherently, so it's not just that he does more of those. So you kind of have to look at each segment individually. So we can kind of have a feel for who he is without analyzing any of the actions or quality of the actions behind it. So we can kind of select core buckets, so what really makes David Silva. I've just done a top 20 of what he was involved in, but in theory you could get very specific as a club of what you're actually looking for in the profile of the player. And then it's been a very simple percentile in each of the buckets, and then just an averaged percentile. So very minimal analysis on top of the framework. I've filtered out players that didn't play more than 900 minutes, less than 28, and then they had to be a midfielder or an attacking midfielder. So just from the number of actions, you can get a top 10 list with obviously some interesting names. The top one of that list makes a lot of sense. And this is without adding a complex analysis on top, without any which actions did they do, what were the success rates, and already you're starting to see a top 10 of interesting looking profiles. So that's the framework. I've just built a couple of utility cases on top, but there's loads of different directions that you could go with this. And it doesn't necessarily have to be this style, but hopefully it's helped you kind of reconnect with Marek's kind of advice of trying to look at sequences differently, trying to pull out the context, spatial and temporal within the raw data without the need for tracking data on top of that, which is obviously will help get to the conclusions as well, but this is a much easier, cheaper, and computationally less expensive route as well.